Welcome to Sand Compounding. When it comes to entrepreneurship as well as when it comes to investing, it's very important to understand competitive landscape. There are lots and lots of research and books written on competitive analysis, competitive strategy, advantage, moats. Moat is a term coined by Warren Buffett in the field of investing. It's not only from investing standpoint, even as an entrepreneur or a startup founder, it's very important to understand how to establish, how to strategize and create that competitive advantage, and that too that can be sustained in the long periods of time. That gives a good runway for your business to run and generate profits. In this session, I have done some deep dive into competitive strategy, competitive advantages, and some reference materials on where we can learn more from on this concept. So competition is inevitable in capitalistic world where when there are huge profits and a profit pool, many players will try to jump in and grab a share of that profit pool when they see that many firms are making money. Certain businesses, certain industries attracts, and it could be disrupted completely when there are many players jumping in, and when the competitive environment becomes prompt and prominent, it really destroys value because the firms lose their pricing abilities and there'll be war of pricing, and when it is not a good scenario to survive in. And so it is very important to have a competitive strategy and competitive advantage, especially which are sustainable over long periods of time to create the wealth. As investors, we should really understand the competitive landscape of the firms. What kind of businesses are the ones we are investing in, and what kind of competition or threats that can arise from internal as well as external factors. And to get into details of this, there are two big volumes written by Michael Porter. Michael Porter is somebody can be like an idol for to look up to to understand the competitive advantages and the competitive strategy. There are two books written by him, as the picture shows. Both are must-read books. It is quite effort-intensive. These are big volumes, and many of them might or might not register easily. It might need a reread, but it's worth going through this whole volumes of books to understand how industries work, operate, and how different companies come over the competitive threats, and how different companies get destroyed. And the most famous of this whole the outcome of this study was Porter's 5 forces model of competitive advantages. And in this picture you could see that there are 5 factors like threats of the new entrants which could disrupt, beginning of the bargaining of power of suppliers, that is itself a competitive advantage. Bargaining power of buyers is an advantage. The competitive rivalry could be one, and then the threat of substitutes of products in the market could be one. So there are this 5 forces model is a easy read and understand. It's a good understanding point to get the concept. And there are other references for competition and moat study. Competition Demystified is a simplified version, I would say concise version of the competitive books written by Michael Porter. This is written by Bruce Greenwald, who is also a professor in Columbia Business School, who teaches a popular course called Value Investing. And this book is certainly an indispensable one to understand the competitive strategy. The better part of this book is that it is written in very simple terms, and there are good case scenarios well documented. For example, there was a case study, I believe, about Intel in this book, and really Bruce Greenwald and the co-authors have gone in depth and understood and explained how to look at the competitive threats, the landscape, and what kind of competitive advantage that Intel has created. And there are multiple other case studies which are nice to understand. And this book is a little dated back, it's somewhere 2002 or 3, sometime like that, and so the latest of the examples might not be reflected there. And this book highlights two main concepts. One is there are two tests basically to understand how the competitive advantage exists. They are like the market share stability and high return on capital, which will confirm or indicate that there is a competitive advantage existing in the business. Also, the competitive advantages can be due to high entry barriers and are usually originating due to proprietary technologies like the research and patents, that companies can have, especially on the technology front and the pharmaceutical fronts. Then the low cost resources, where when there is a market where we could go and get resources, whether it is human resources or it is on the supply side resources for raw materials, etc., which is another source of competitive advantage. Then there is customer captivity, which is most important, I would say, in understanding the competitive advantage, especially in the consumer behavior. If the customer mindshare is procured, it serves a lot of competitive advantage for firms. Economies of scale is another important factor which has been dealt a lot by the authors in this book, especially economies of scale advantage and operating leverage, and such advantages, how they translate into competitive advantages. And finally, the regulatory advantages and licenses. These might be transitory or it could be permanent, but the regulatory advantages are typically associated with the government and things like that. So this is a nice book to understand the competitive landscape. The last being the Measuring the Moat by Michael Mauboussin. This is not a book; it's an article or a paper that is published through Credit Suisse. Michael Mauboussin is one of my favorite author who has done a lot of research papers, and books too. And this one is a must read to understand how he goes about assessing the magnitude and sustainability of the value creation. And you could see in the picture that's a moat, which the term coined by Warren Buffett to indicate the competitive advantages that the businesses can create. And a couple of points I would like to indicate here is that one of the advantage that Michael Mauboussin has brought in is the high learning curve being an entry deterrent. And these are called entry barriers, right? I mean, any of the competitive advantage could potentially be the existing of the entry barriers, where businesses find it very difficult to enter into the space, and even if they have to, it will be not sustainable. Now there are businesses which have been analyzed, and also high exit barriers, it's being another deterrent. It's another point which I did not read in other books. So this is another must read article or a paper to understand the competitive advantage. Overall, to put together, understanding competitive advantages that the businesses has, or even understanding the threats for their business existence itself will be a great advantage for us as investor when we invest money in. There could be businesses which are completely disrupted in no time, or even in 3 to 5 years time, mid to long term, and we need to, as investors, we need to understand where the threats can come from, and how the businesses can be disrupted, whether these businesses have really the competitive advantages. The real measure of competitive advantage existing is the return on capital, and when firms can have continuously maintain higher returns on invested capital more than the cost of capital, that indicates that there is something fundamentally inherent for these businesses in terms of competitive advantage. And then the next step would be to assess what advantage they have, whether that can be taken away by the competitors or other business players in the field, and will the profit pool be impacted. All of those kind of business in analysis that needs to be done, and these books will definitely help us do such analysis. These gives a template framework to analyze the competitive advantages of the firms. So that brings us to the end of this session. Hope it was helpful.